welcoming Dr. Steve Barrett.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to return to talk to Merseyside Skeptics once again. So this is UFOs. And perhaps you can see from the little subtitle there, I'm asking about images of UFOs. I am not talking about anecdotes. I'm not talking about verbal reports. I am not talking about alien abductions. I'm talking about images because that's one of my research interests. Looking at images and figuring out how to process them and analyze them is part of what I do with my research in the University of Liverpool. So let's start with just one or two statistics just to give us the right sort of frame. One of the reasons I did this talk was because I'm interested in images. The other was because I found these statistics, which I couldn't quite believe at the time. Now, it's a limited survey, but when a survey of some, let us say, Americans and probably American students were asked about have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth, according to a survey I found, the answer was something like 40% of this particular cohort said probably. Now, the survey was Chapman University. I don't know how reliable that is, and I haven't attempted to bring it up to date. It's a pre-pandemic survey. So, have extraterrestrials visited Earth? 40%. When asked a similar question, are they visiting Earth now? In other words, are they walking amongst us? Well, the figure wasn't so different. The figure was 35%, which I found rather astonishing. Especially when in the same survey, it turns out that that number of 40 to 35% is less than the number who believed in ghosts, which was substantially higher at 60%, but the number, 35, 40%, was greater than the number that believed in telekinesis, 25%, or Bigfoot, 20%, but the most worrying statistic I found in this survey was that the number of people who believed that aliens walk among us was actually greater than the number who believed in evolution. Now, yes, this is America, but I'd love to know what the equivalent statistics were for Europe, or specifically United Kingdom. So that made me think about whether people really do believe that these lights in the sky or these odd things that you sometimes see are indeed extraterrestrial visitations. I saw this particular cartoon saying, surely, isn't it now settled? Surely that's an old problem, UFOs. That's a 1960s, 1970s problem. Because if you look at the graph of the percentage of, in this case again, the US population, that carry cameras with them everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives, you can see that it was almost zero until, well, the iPhone came along. And since then, everybody's had a camera in their pocket. So surely, without any fanfare at all, we've now conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, etc. So you'd think that was now a closed situation. But no. If you Google UFO, you don't find thousands of web pages, you don't find millions of web pages, you find at least 250 million web pages. That's the last time I tried a couple of years ago, just to see who was still interested in finding and posting information about UFOs. So that implies that despite the fact that everybody has a camera, it's still not settled as to whether they exist or not. So I'm looking at UFO images. I'm not going through the past history of the last 50 or so years, looking at what people have said about UFOs and what people have reported about UFOs. I'm simply finding some images which people claim to be UFOs and applying the principle of, well, is there a simpler explanation for what some people claim to be unidentified? So UFO images could, in principle, fall into a number of categories. I would say there are basically 4 categories, or maybe 5. Man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, which is one that was particularly interesting to me, and that's where I got started in this. And finally, of course, there is some deliberate fakery. And the elephant in the room is, well, there really ought to be a 5th category. And the 5th category of UFOs is they could be extraterrestrial spacecraft. So I'm going to address each of those and show you a few examples that fall into each of these categories and ask, even though people might have claimed they look like UFOs, is there a relatively simple explanation for what we're looking at? Let's just make sure we've got definitions right. I conform to the convention for UFOs. A UFO is something observed in the sky that's not readily identified. You could argue that if you see a bird and you don't know which species it is, it's an unidentified bird. But here we're talking about unidentified objects. We cannot readily tell what they are. And regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I will always side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I don't need to tell skeptics, but I'll reiterate it anyway. Another useful tool, of course, is Occam's razor. If there are two explanations for an observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is generally preferred, is usually better. So in other words, if you've got two options for explaining something, generally speaking, the simpler one is more likely to be correct compared to the rather complex explanation for what it is we're looking at. So where do we find reliable information about UFOs? Well, we can always just Google images and see what crops up, which is sort of what I did to see what's out there. There are alternatives. You can go to America and find reliable information about UFOs at the UFO Information Center. You can tell it's reliable because there's a green alien sitting on the porch there, ready to greet you. But I did start to wonder, well, how are we going to separate the wheat from the chaff? Because, of course, if we want to see evidence for extraterrestrial spacecraft, what we would really like to see is an image that is clear and detailed and in focus, with no camera shake from the person taking the picture, and well exposed, so that we can then say, well, there is evidence that this spacecraft appears to be floating in the air and it doesn't look like anything man-made. That's what we would like a UFO picture to look like. But 99.9% of the UFO images out there actually look more like that. They are generally blurred, out of focus, with loads of camera movement, and they are nearly always overexposed. If they're taken at night, it's almost universally accepted that a bright point of light in the sky will be overexposed if you try and take a picture of it. Blowing it up doesn't help, it just turns a small blur into a big blur. And if the image is pre-digital, then we've got no idea what circumstances were surrounding that picture. We've got no idea the date it was taken, the time it was taken. We've got no idea which way the camera was pointing. We've got no idea what the camera was, what the lens was, what the aperture of the lens was, what the shutter speed of the camera was. All we have is probably the anecdote of somebody who claims to have taken that picture. But we can really do nothing with an image like that because there is essentially no information in it. You can't do image processing and image analysis if there's no information in the image. All I can say about that is that whatever this image was, whatever this object was, it was probably brighter than the surroundings. That's it. That's all you can say about that image. So unfortunately, although I found quite a few UFO images, which I was keen on looking at, the bottom line is virtually all of them had to go onto the pile of there's nothing I can do with that. And there's only a small number where I could actually effectively look at it and effectively unpick it. I wondered what the first UFO was, and I looked at this thinking, well, that's interesting. We've got a hieroglyphic here from the Egyptian period where we have an Apache helicopter in the top left, and we have Luke Skywalker's land speeder over here, and we have a Zeppelin. That's interesting. So I assumed, oh, well, obviously this image has simply been doctored. Somebody's taken some hieroglyphs, put it into Photoshop, and changed the image. Turns out, no, that's a genuine set of hieroglyphs. And that got me interested. If that is not a doctored version of the picture, then I'm curious as to why these objects appear the way they do. The explanation, when I dug a little deeper, turned out to be interesting but not useful in terms of UFOs. It turns out that that's not a helicopter or a speeder or a Zeppelin. It turns out that there were two pharaohs, one of whom produced a whole load of hieroglyphics, and then along came another one who also produced a whole load of hieroglyphics, and just like turning a piece of paper over and putting it through the photocopier or putting it through the printer again, here one pharaoh had chiseled his hieroglyphs over the top of the other and hadn't done a very good job of eliminating the previous set of hieroglyphs. So actually we've got effectively a superposition, a bit like printing onto paper that's already had some print on it. If you separate the two in terms of color, one Pharaoh Seti I in blue and the other one, Ramses II, in green, then you can see that what appears to be a helicopter and a speeder and a zeppelin just falls to pieces when you realize that it's simply the superposition of two sets of symbols, and it's our eye and our brain that is convincing us there's actually something there, where in fact there's nothing interesting there. It's just a whole load of birds and objects and probably hand tools and a few other things like that. So I was slightly disappointed to find that that is not the first UFO documented. So let's look at the first category. UFOs might be man-made objects. Okay, the US Air Force is trying to make life easy for us. So the US Air Force, we know, has certain spy planes out there that take off at the dead of night and fly around Nevada and Utah, etc. But to make sure we don't confuse them with UFOs, they've produced this very convenient chart. So I'm not sure you can identify which are spy planes, but the Air Force has identified these objects as 1, a weather balloon, 2, a weather balloon, 3, a weather balloon, 4, a weather balloon, 5, a weather balloon. Any idea what the next one is? Swamp gas. Next one, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, and it might look like a B-1 bomber, but no, that's a weather balloon as well. So the US is helping us regarding getting our UFOs right. This is one that intrigued me. So let's do a little straw poll. If this is a long exposure of these streaks of light, which I hope show up reasonably well here, we have a dark object here, which is just a leaf on a tree that happens to be in front of the camera. We have a number of streaks. So is this a fleet of UFOs flying in formation, or is it something else? Does it look like the contrails of aircraft? Anybody think that might be aircraft? Mm-hmm. If it was aircraft, we have to ask ourselves, is it commercial aircraft? They leave contrails in the sky, but you wouldn't expect to see a whole load like this. If it was military, military do fly in formation, but they fly a lot tighter formation than that. So it doesn't look like commercial aircraft, doesn't look like military aircraft. So what is it that's streaking across the sky here? Yes, sir? They would have to, we don't know what lens was used on this camera, so we can't tell. Stars will, you wouldn't get a whole batch like that. If you're looking to the north, stars will move in circles around the North Pole. If you're looking towards the equator, stars will move in approximately straight lines. These stars appear to be converging, so they appear to be getting closer together. Now that might be perspective, it might be something else. Other people have suggested, what about satellites? Well, yes, Elon Musk has thrown up lots of satellites into the sky, and they do end up in constellations in the sense of lots of dots of light moving together. But generally speaking, they get launched and end up as a sort of line, a dotted line, rather than lots of objects moving in parallel. So this is an example where I know exactly what the source is, the source of the image. And the source of the image does not make any claim to this being a UFO, even though we know it's not we think it's not aircraft, it's not satellites, it's not stars, it's not comets, it's not asteroids, it's not anything else. And I know the source of this, and they're not claiming it's a UFO, but I put this up here deliberately with some misdirection. And I put the misdirection in there to make the point that when you actually look, for instance, on the web or in books or in other reports, newspapers, for instance, it is very common to find a picture of something odd with a narrative that is completely fake and invented and doesn't relate to the picture whatsoever. So I have deliberately misdirected you by showing you a picture and then telling you it was a long exposure. In other words, I've given you the idea that something was moving through space or through the sky and has produced these streaks. Actually, no. This is actually a snapshot. And where did I find this picture? From Pylon of the Month, December 2019. Pylon? Yes, pylon, as in electricity pylon. What is this a picture of? It's a picture of an electricity pylon. Now, the pylon is somewhere in the distance, but it's a foggy night. And so you can't actually see the electricity pylon because of the fog. So what are these lines? They're the electricity cables, illuminated by some light on the other side of the horizon. If I told you it was a snapshot, you might conceivably have guessed that it's electrical cables in the sky. But because I told you it was a long exposure, you immediately start thinking things are moving, and so what is it that's produced those trails? My point here is not necessarily to fool you, but to remind you that the pictures you look at and the narrative that goes with them sometimes are deliberately misleading. So, if you want to explore pylons for yourself, feel free. www.pylonofthemonth.org. I kid you not, it's a real web page. Go look at it. For those sad individuals that want to spend their time admiring the pylons of the UK, I don't know if they go any further, then that's always there for you. I just thought this was an intriguing one, and I'm pretty sure, I am pretty sure that if you take that image out of context, it is very easy to say, oh, there's something interesting going on here. Well, it is interesting in a sense, but only interesting to a photographer, not to a ufologist.
Is the light a UFO?
Beg your pardon?
Is the light like the pylon behind the UFO?
Not to my knowledge, but then given that you can't see it, and it's presumably not flying if it's below the horizon, but who can say? And again, I mean, that would be excusable. If I saw that in the sky, I would think, yes, space jellyfish, obviously alien invaders. There were a lot of these at the time, the Falcon rockets, Elon Musk again, at the time these were going up, there were a lot of vapor trails produced by the Falcon rockets. So they produced spectacular images. But if you weren't expecting to see that, and indeed some people weren't expecting to see that, there were plenty of UFO reports when these things went up. Those that were expecting them knew where to put the camera and got some beautiful images of the Falcon rocket going up with these tails produced by the exhaust from the rocket getting caught in the upper winds of the atmosphere. And if you're looking in the right direction, you can get not only the rocket itself, but a huge nebula, in other words, an artificial cloud produced by the rocket exhaust. But if you're not expecting to see that, it can look rather amazing. And if you catch rocket exhaust or rocket trails at the right time of day, just as the sun is coming through them, you end up with, or you can get these beautiful iridescent colors, which again, perhaps nobody would confuse that with a UFO, but plenty of people could look at a phenomena like this and say, wow, what the hell is going on here? That looks totally unnatural and it doesn't look man-made either. So again, you can understand that people sometimes see things which are quite rare and come to the wrong conclusion. If you saw a lot of dots in the sky like this, what would you assume is going on? Some little wiggles in the foreground, in the lower part of the image, and then some blobs, and then a large blue smudge. If you didn't understand what was going on, and perhaps if you didn't have a scientific background, you may assume this was magic, you may assume it was UFOs, you might assume it was aliens. It doesn't take that much digging to find out what's going on at the moment in terms of rocketry, what have NASA put up in the last day or two. This particular image, I have a number of these references down in the corner. Anything that's got APOD means astronomy picture of the day. NASA put up an image every day of something interesting that's happening. This particular one in 2019 was an image of what's going on when they sent up sounding rockets. They sent up sounding rockets really high, something like 100 miles up, and released fluorescent dyes, fluorescent gases. Then the sunlight hits these gases and makes them glow either a cyany color or a blue color. And by releasing gas into the upper atmosphere and then monitoring what happens, you can see what these winds are at very high levels of the atmosphere. Very useful to try to figure out what's happening with aurora, because aurora occur because particles hit the upper atmosphere, and knowing what the upper atmosphere is doing, 100 miles, the air is very thin, 100 miles up, but it still exists, and there are still very high velocity winds up there. So this is simply the result of a scientific experiment. But again, if you weren't expecting to see that, it looks rather odd. I'm not sure there's any of these around anymore. Google Loon was a project set up by Google to put up large objects in the upper atmosphere that would reflect radio waves and hence improve radio communication between different regions. It must have been a spectacular sight to see one of these floating through the air, but as far as I know, they abandoned the project, so not many of these were actually sighted. And here, this is again a few years ago now, and I think you've probably already sussed what these are. A few years ago, these would have been considered quite unusual, but now we've seen these sorts of things more commonly. Can you tell what these are? Drones, yeah. In the last few years, we've seen the accuracy with which drones can fly getting much, much, much higher. So here it's a little bit of a ragged formation. Now the accuracy with which you can position these drones is 10 to 100 times better, so you get much better arrangements and patterns. And I can again see the time when people decide to fly these particular patterns in the shape of a little flying saucer or something else to confuse people as to what they're actually looking at. A number of people have said, oh yeah, I know UFOs exist because I've seen their landing sites. I overflew the Nevada desert the other day and it's very clear that there were 3 landing sites in the desert, which is where they would have landed. Anybody who makes that claim very rarely bothers to check, for instance, satellite images or even Google Earth images. If you flew from A to B and you saw them halfway through the journey, it's very easy to work out where you were, which state you were over, and then go to Google Earth and see what's there. In this particular case, it might look rather unusual, fine, but not inexplicable. If you find out what's there, you find there's a solar power plant. Lots of reflecting mirrors that are reflecting sunlight into this central region to obtain a very high temperature. Depending on the angle at which you look at all of these mirrors and the angle of the sun at the time, you can get a very odd looking reflection. And from a high-flying aircraft, it can look weird. But weird doesn't mean unidentifiable. It just means you haven't bothered to find out what it actually was that you were looking at. There's plenty of videos of UFOs flying around. Rather oddly, they seem to be all in America, but well, there you go. This particular one has a very annoying audio, which I've taken off. The person is very frantically describing the fact that he can see a cigar-shaped object. He obviously is fairly convinced he doesn't want to keep the camera still. There's a cigar-shaped object hovering over the lake in a very UFO sort of fashion. This appeared, I think, in local newspapers that evening and the following day, and probably for many days thereafter, saying this is an amazing discovery to actually see one of these UFOs and capture it on video. Even though a few hours after it was posted on social media, the perpetrators immediately said, that's us. The Goodyear blimp people said, there's no point in calling this a UFO, that is quite definitely us. You were taking video over a lake and there was a ballpark on the other side of the water, and that was us monitoring this particular ball game. So even when they say, don't get excited guys, that's definitely us, the story continues, because the story is more interesting than the explanation. And that's part of how these things tend to propagate. And how can you deal with UFOs when almost anything can be put into either orbit or into the high atmosphere? The sky is not just full of birds and planes, it's also full of footwear, because people like Nike decide to do a publicity stunt and send something into 100,000 feet orbit or thereabouts. If you look up, bam, that's what it looks like when the weather balloon pops and eventually the object comes back down again. So it's unlikely that you see a Nike going across the sky and think, ooh, an unidentified flying object. But these days, there's so much rubbish in the sky other than birds and planes, you can never be too sure. So wasn't I excited when I found on, I think it was YouTube, super clear footage, it said. Here we have 100% proof of a UFO taken with super clear clarity. So I thought, fantastic, at last somebody has managed to take a nice, well-focused, steady shot of a UFO. Let's see what it actually looks like. So there it is. Any thoughts on what that might have been? I know I didn't give you many seconds to figure it out, but any thoughts? Eventually, this guy settled down a bit and steadied out his hand or steadied himself against a wall or something, and then you could see what this object is. So to start with, it was very frantic, but after a little while, you start to say, well, that's not very interesting. What is it? It's a Mylar balloon. Somebody had a party. I don't know if it's a unicorn or a horse or whether it's a J. Maybe a young guy called Joseph or a young girl called Jennifer had a party. They had a big mylar balloon with a J in the shape of a J. It escaped and went up into the atmosphere and it caught the sunlight. Not interesting at all, but when you have a glistening object in the distance, glinting in the sunlight, and you can't see immediately what it is, it gets labeled a UFO. Unfortunately, a lot of people have this knee-jerk reaction. I've seen something, I don't know what it is, I'm not going to ask any more questions. If I can't tell what it is in 5 seconds, it must be a UFO. It could be aliens. And it's a shame that so many potential UFOs that are reported fall into the category of they just didn't give it more than 10 seconds thought before deciding what it was they were actually looking at. So a lot of UFOs are man-made. Quite a number are natural objects. We've looked at pylons of the month already, but did you know that the Cloud Appreciation Society has a cloud of the month? Yes, I kid you not, go look it up. Cloud of the month. So cloud of the month for January in the year I can't remember. These look quite interesting, so-called lenticular clouds, which are often confused with spaceship type, disky sort of things, flying saucers if you like. Some don't look very convincing, but occasionally you get a lenticular cloud which is quite spectacular. This was quite interesting because it seems to be a sort of semicircle of something sitting in this cloud. There's a little bird up there which is just a bird, but in the base of the cloud there appears to be these little loops, and the loops appear to be in what appears to be a perfect semicircle. As far as I can see, it's not a complete circle, but you look at this and you say, well, surely this is natural cloud formation, but why should it occur in a semicircle, this particular little fluffs of cloud that appear to be coming below the cloud deck itself? And again, if you find out where this particular picture was taken, you find there's an airfield a few miles away. And what happens when aircrafts want to come into an airfield and it's busy? They're put into a holding pattern. So what's almost certainly happened here is that an aircraft that you can't see, that might be actually inside the cloud itself, because it's relatively low cloud here. So the aircraft could be waiting to come into the airfield. The aircraft is inside the cloud, and as the aircraft moves, it disturbs the cloud and produces these little bubbles. When you put an aircraft into a holding pattern, you don't normally send them in circles. You often send them in a racetrack. They move along in a straight line, then they turn round, like at the end of a running track, and then again retrace their steps and then do another 180-degree turn and then continue round and round until the airfield is ready to take them. So this is probably the semicircular loop at the end of an aircraft's holding pattern, and it just happens to be disturbing the cloud and leaving this sort of telltale trace. So it's sort of a combination of natural and man-made in that respect. You can see that some lenticular clouds actually are quite convincing in terms of they are relatively symmetrical and at first glance can look rather artificial. That is not necessarily something that will be confused with a UFO, but it always strikes me as looking like very similar to the sort of special effect you see in the early stages of Independence Day when a big spaceship comes out of a cloud and reveals itself to the public below. And here, some people have said, well, yeah, there's a big hole punched out of the clouds. This is obviously where a large flying saucer has come down, has punched its way through the cloud and then presumably landed where we can't see it, but it's left this circular hole in the cloud. Circles don't seem very natural when we're looking at clouds for the same reason that catches our eye as looking rather odd when we're looking at clouds. But there are good meteorological reasons why you might get a region where the temperature and the pressure and the water vapor is such that it is possible to get a circular region where no clouds form. I'm not going to go into the meteorology, but that is a perfectly natural phenomena, even though it looks a bit odd at first glance. And you can get spectacular clouds forming over the top of mountains. For instance, here, this lenticular cloud forming over the top of Mount Fuji. Spectacular though that is, some people don't think that's good enough. And they will take that image, slap it into Photoshop, and add a few more for good measure, just because they think that looks even more spectacular, as if the original wasn't good enough. Mother Nature isn't good enough when you can double, treble, quadruple it up. This I quite like because you start to wonder, has an alien invasion actually started? Have we had UFOs in the sky landed on the other side of these houses and they are now shooting beams of light up into the sky? There's nothing going on there, there's no fair, there's no activity, there's just a few street lights on the other side of these houses. So what must the UFOs be doing? They must have landed and started shining lights up into the sky, presumably. If you're living in the sort of regions where this happens, you probably see it all the time. If you're living in more temperate regions, you don't see this very often, and so this can look rather odd. But all that's going on here, perhaps you can tell that there's snow on the ground here, and you might be able to read that this is Finland. So we're talking Scandinavia, snow on the ground, and a lot of ice crystals in the air. So what we're looking at is nothing peculiar other than we're looking at light reflection, so-called light pillars. So there are light sources down here, street lights of the town beyond the houses, and the ice in the atmosphere is crystallized into small hexagonal platelets, rather small, bit like snowflakes, but they're all sitting horizontally because that's how they prefer to sit in the atmosphere. So they're acting like a whole set of small mirrors, which means each of these little ice crystals up here is reflecting the light below it. And so you get these apparent beams of light. They're simply lots of ice crystals reflecting the light below. So each of these will finish in a light source which we can't see because they were on the other side of the houses. Sometimes that gives a rather spectacular result. Some of the light sources, the pillars are different colors simply because the light sources are different colors. So behind the horizon where we can't see them, there are lots of lights, some of which are bluish and some of which are yellowish, and so we get this beautiful effect of this forest of light pillars. But I think the most spectacular one is where these ice crystals actually form fairly high up, and so you get this effect where the ice crystals reflect the light, so the light sources are down here on the horizon, a long way away, and yet you get these reflections up there. You virtually get a city in the sky. It can be quite spectacular. I've never seen one for myself, but I've seen a number of these images, and I'm told it can be absolutely spectacular to see what looks like an entire city floating in the sky. So again, if you're not from these regions where you might see this quite often, it can give you the impression of something very odd flying through the air. The crystals sometimes get unbalanced. Usually they are horizontal, and so the pillar is vertical, but you notice here the pillars are quite narrow up to a certain height, and then above, I don't know, maybe 50 meters or so, the ice crystals start to rock, they start to get a little bit turbulent, they start to move, and so the light pillars start to fan out. And so you get this odd effect of what looks like trees made of light growing, again, each of them starting from a particular light source. This is not Scandinavia, this is the northern parts of the United States. Let's have a look at a video of the sky where there's a couple of houses here, and we're looking at the gap between two houses, and we're looking up, and something odd is happening here. Something appears to be hiding in the cloud. Something appears to be jumping around. You watch it, and it suddenly flicks and suddenly moves. And it produces a little arc, and then suddenly it changes again. If you work out how big this is, it's quite a large object at quite a substantial distance, you can figure out that whatever's moving there must be moving very rapidly, and yet the water in the cloud around it seems not to be moving at all. And you look at that and you think, well, that's very odd. Is there something hiding in the cloud there? It's a phenomena which you don't see very often, and if you don't see it very often, it's easy to say, I don't know what that is, it's unidentified, I can't explain it, and it's up there in the sky, therefore it must be something to do with UFOs and aliens. In fact, what's going on in this particular case is quite interesting. Let me just run the video again. It looks like something is physically moving backwards and forwards in the sky. But actually, the only movement there is what we saw before, ice crystals. There are ice crystals up in that thunderstorm. It's not obvious it's a thunderstorm because we can't see the rest of it, but there's a lot of ice up there that's a very low temperature, and the ice can be oriented by the electric fields. And thunderstorms, remember, thunderstorms are electrically charged. They would like to discharge the lightning down to Earth. There's a lot of electrical fields up there, and the ice crystals can move if the electric fields of the cloud change. So the water isn't going anywhere. The change that you see here, suddenly brightening or suddenly dimming, is simply ice crystals that are moving very rapidly because they're not physically being transported anywhere. They're just tilting to reflect more light or reflect less light. And so we get dramatic changes there just by slight reorientations of ice crystals. This again is rather rare in the sense that I don't think many people will have seen this particular phenomena, and I don't think it's usually this bright or this red. It's a phenomena called red sprites. If you have a thunderstorm, which we can't really see in this image, you're used to the idea that a thunderstorm will have lightning below it when electrical charge tries to neutralize between charge buildup in the cloud and charge buildup on the ground below it. But it's also possible that you get sort of, in a sense, upward lightning. In other words, it's electrical discharges above a thundercloud that discharges into space. And that produces these characteristic red sprites. They're rare enough that people didn't actually know whether they existed or not a few decades ago, and those who reported seeing them were often assumed to be just delusional. And it wasn't until they were actually captured on film and on video that we realized there are phenomena that occur above thunderstorms as well as below thunderstorms. One of my favorite accounts is this one of an arc-shaped UFO over Ontario. Before showing you the image, I'll show you the narrative. It was near the end of the day. I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion, a UFO. If you don't know what it is, it's a UFO. This bright light in the sky, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. How can you tell how big it is? If there's a dot in the sky, you can't tell how far away it is. Virtually no object that's barely bigger than a point in the sky, at no point can you judge the distance. So how can you possibly judge the actual size of this object? My friend says as big as 2 airliners. I thought 1, but he might be right. So what was it this person was looking at? End of the day. So if you're in the evening, facing west, and there's a brilliant point of light in the sky, what are they looking at?
The moon.
Try again.
Reflection.
Not the sun. That, most people know what the sun looks like. The moon, again, is not a point of light. It's a big thing. Brilliant white. Brilliant white, brightest star you ever see in the west.
Venus.
Venus, thank you. Venus, yes. So there it is, Venus. This was the picture he actually took. The other hint is arc-shaped, and you might think, well, yeah, the moon can be crescent-shaped, but Venus? Yes, absolutely. Venus goes through phases just like the moon. You tend not to notice it because it's only a small object in the sky, because of course Venus is a long way away compared to the moon. If you happen to have a pair of binoculars, just the sort of ones you would use for bird watching, a magnification of ×8, ×10, if you get those binoculars, next time Venus is in the west as an evening star, if you get your binoculars out, you'll be able to see that Venus does show phases. You don't need a telescope, you don't need a huge magnification. You can tell that Venus sometimes shows a half phase, sometimes shows a crescent phase. You can see that with binoculars. And in this case, the person captured it with their camera with some sort of a telephoto zoom lens. But quite definitely, this is a point object as far as human vision is concerned, and just about extends into an arc when you magnify it, but no way could you say that this object is the size of 2 airliners. That is just fooling yourself into thinking you've got a handle on how far this object is away. They were looking at Venus, millions of miles away, and they assumed that they were looking at a point of light that was being generated maybe a mile or 2 away or something like that. Pure assumption, and a reminder of how easily the eye and the brain can be fooled. So we've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects. Let's look at image artifacts, because an awful lot of images which people claim are UFOs are indeed image artifacts. One of the oldest I could find was this one. Mysterious lights were seen in the sky and photographed over Washington, D.C. in 1952. Looking at it, I assume this is the Capitol building. It looks like it is. And we can see these little objects flying and buzzing around the top of the dome there, looking like little TIE fighters. So how might we explain these objects that seem to be all buzzing around the dome? Well, one thing you can do, well, one thing we can't do, but in principle we ought to be able to do, is ask the photographer. Did the photographer see these? Or are these things that just showed up on the images once the photographs were taken? That's a good way of telling if you've got an image artifact. Did you see them at the time? If the answer was no, then almost certainly you're looking at an image artifact. So what are these? Well, it's very easy to tell definitively what these objects actually are, and that is to look at the lights down at the front there, these lights that are shining into the camera. Take those lights, turn them upside down, and position them up at the top there. Dot, 2 dots, 2 dots, 2 dots, dot, dot. There would be 2 of them here, but you can't see them because they're against the dome. All we're looking at is reflections of what's going on down here. Every camera lens, every set of optics, ideally the lens will take the light and focus the light onto the camera film or the camera CCD if it's a digital image. But inevitably, there will be some reflections. Every time light hits the surface of a lens, a lot of it will go through the lens, but some of it will be reflected. If the source of light is bright enough, you will see a reflection somewhere in the image. And this is the 1950s. Camera lenses weren't that good quality compared to what you can get these days. And so we're simply seeing the reflections of all the lamps, all the lights that are there in the foreground of this particular view of the Capitol. So no, those would not have been seen in the sky. They simply show up in the image because of image artifacts. This one I quite like, again, because of the narrative. There is no way people actually saw this. This is quite definitively an artifact of the way the image was taken, the way the image was acquired in a camera. And yet still people will say, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. Yeah. That it was a large craft. It came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. And I presume by windows they mean this thing where you can see the pilot waving at you there. You ask yourself, well, no, there is no way you actually saw that, because that we can tell is an artifact, and one of the ways we can tell that is by looking at the context. It doesn't matter whether you say, yeah, well, this is 100% proof of alien visitation. It's 100%, you can't get better than that, and it's definitely aliens because they put it in capitals. So it really must be important in this particular case. But if you look at the whole image, not this particular crop of the image, if you look at the original image, you realize that the camera is pointing at a very bright moon, which is shining into the lens. What's going to happen when you have a very bright light shining into the lens? You're going to get a reflection. In this case, a horrible distorted reflection because this lens wasn't a particularly high quality lens, I would guess. But again, there's no way that was actually visible at the time. It is purely something that's inside the camera because of the way that light interacts with glass. A more modern version, this was one I found on Twitter. I don't tweet myself, but I found this via a Twitter feed, where somebody had taken a picture and then saw something very odd in the top left-hand corner. And they said, what is this in the sky? I seem to have captured this. It seems to have an aura around it. Perhaps you can't see it on this particular projector, but there's an object there with a very faint oval around it, and that's what they mean by the aura. This person is asking, by feeding this out to Twitter, is this a UFO? Is it a UFO? At least they're being reasonable at saying, I don't know what it is, can somebody tell me? And they attached a hashtag UFO. And just to show that they were being totally reasonable and they did want an answer, they included hashtag serious question. So they weren't simply saying, I've got a UFO, isn't it amazing? They were basically saying, can somebody please tell me what this is? And so you can see from this theme that it falls into the same category. What sort of picture are we taking? We're shooting into the sun. The sun is just trying to creep on this side of the building. They thought it made a very arty picture, which I guess it does, very nice. but the sun is creeping around this side of the building. So if we take this up here and just blow it up so we can see it a little better, again, for those that remember Independence Day, sorry to hark back to that, it just seems to suit in this particular case. One of the early images of a UFO arriving on Independence Day was a large disc-like object with some sort of tentacles coming down from it. So you could look at this and say, well, that's very UFO-ish. That's definitely an alien craft with some legs or some appendages below there. Or you can say to yourself, well, what's actually going on? The sun is here. The sun is a small disk in the sky, not very big, but it's a disk in the sky. And in this particular case, the sun is partially hidden by this wall. Reflections, generally speaking, are upside down compared to the original image. So if this produced a reflection, what would we expect to see? Well, we would expect to see a circular disk which was partly hidden by the edge of the wall. And the sun is shining through this filigree work of this lamp support, which is what we're seeing here. So it's a disc that's partly cut off with some filigree work. It is exactly what you would expect to see if the sun was shining through this lamp support bracket there. And not surprisingly, because the sun is shining directly into the camera, it's producing a reflection. This might have been a good quality lens, but when you're dealing with the sun, much brighter than the moon, you're bound to get some sort of reflection. This is another example that I was trying to draw your attention to earlier, where the narrative doesn't bear any resemblance whatsoever to the picture. So I looked at this picture, which was supposedly a UFO, and the accompanying text was saying, note the power lines in the photo. As you can see, the wires show absolutely no distortion, which would indicate no camera jerk. Wires? Wires? Okay, they're trying to claim that if I actually moved the camera when I took this picture, things would be blurred, but there are objects in here that are so sharp, it clearly shows that I didn't move the camera when I took this picture. Also, based on the wires in the photo, you can tell that we were shooting almost straight up. No, I can't tell that you were shooting straight up from that. I took the original image and all I did was play around with the brightness level so I could see a little better what's actually going on in that image. Maybe that helps you, maybe that doesn't, but I am pretty convinced that what we're looking at is the view through a car window, probably on the left-hand side in this particular case. So there's the inside of the vehicle, the car or the van. There's a wing mirror. There's a little bit of illuminated road because of the headlights, and there's a little bit of unilluminated road. So the verge of the road is probably here somewhere. Everything is flying past at a little bit of speed, and you probably can't see, but there are a few scratches on it. And those scratches are what they claim are the wires that show no distortion, no blurring, proving that you're looking up. I am absolutely convinced that we are looking sideways through the window of a car at nothing in particular other than a wing mirror and a few blurry images. So I don't know where these words come from, and I don't know if this was an accident whereby these words apply to an image but that's not the right image, whether they have got confused and somewhere the text and the image have ended up being plastered against some other text and image, or whether that is somebody trying to convince people that this rather blurry object here is actually some blurry lights above that they photographed. But I am certainly not convinced by that. Similarly, here, where somebody has taken a picture of a large slab in the sky, what appears to be a flat rectangular aircraft with lights all the way around the edge, which is fantastic, hovering in the air. Enthusiasts, UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spy craft known as a TR-3B. Notice how much authority you get. Instead of saying it's a UFO, if you can say it's a TR-3B, that shows you've done some research and you can identify it with these 4 digits, these letters and numbers that show that you know what you're talking about, because that's not any old UFO, it's a TR-3B. So it could be a large slab floating in the sky. But I noticed that, I'm pretty sure, this is taken through the windscreen of a car or a van or something else. You can sort of tell because it's dark and it's raining, and you can see the headlights here illuminating raindrops on what I assume is the front windscreen of a car. So we're taking a picture through a windscreen. Is it more likely, we're back to Occam's razor again, is it more likely that this is a large slab floating in the sky with these lights around the edge? Or is it more likely that it's actually an iPhone sitting on the dashboard of the car and it's just reflected? So the iPhone is down here somewhere, sitting on somebody's dashboard, and we're just looking at a large rectangular slab with a little bit of silver around the edges that is catching the light. I'll leave you to decide which you think is the more likely explanation for that one. What about fakery? We've looked at man-made and natural. We've looked at image artifacts. Some UFOs are quite definitely fake. Any picture that needs a finger pointing at it, you can't really convince yourself is a real UFO if you have to point out where the UFO is in the picture. And if there was something like that appearing over, doesn't really matter whether it's America or Europe, something that size appearing over an interstate with a few million people watching it, I think we would have heard about that if such a thing existed. So clearly, some people just like to play around with image software, whether it be Photoshop or something like that. With images such as this, I thought this was intriguing. I started looking at images like this to see if I could tell what was going on. This is claimed to be 2 UFOs buzzing Air Force One as it came into land. And when I looked at that, I convinced myself fairly early on that no, that is fakery, not least because you notice that Air Force One, it's quite blurred because it's a long way in the distance. It's not necessarily blurred because of focus or camera shake. It's blurred simply because there's an awful lot of air between the photographer and the Air Force One itself. So there's a lot of air scattering the light, and hence the contrast isn't particularly high. Even the dark parts of the aircraft don't look particularly black. They just look sort of middle grey rather than jet black. But when we look at the so-called UFOs that are buzzing Air Force One, the contrast is rather different. If these genuinely were in the vicinity or further away than Air Force One, they would also show light scattering from the Earth's atmosphere, and they wouldn't be quite as well defined and quite as contrasty as those objects are. So I couldn't definitively say, but I'm fairly convinced that those look wrong because the contrast and clarity of those objects just doesn't look right compared to what's going on with Air Force One. And I thought I'd be a little more quantitative when I looked at this. You could either say this is a picture of an aircraft carrier with an F-18 jet on it and a helicopter, and either you say that's a very odd military bit of hardware, or you say it's a UFO, which for some reason is sitting on the carrier deck. And I thought, well, it should be possible to definitively say whether or not that has been faked or not. It doesn't look very convincing to me, but not being convinced is not the same as proof that it's been faked. So given that this is sort of not quite what I do for a day job, but I quite often look at images and process and analyze images, I thought I would have a look at the intensity of the pixels on the carrier deck here. I took this stripe sitting next to the F-18 jet, and I asked, how does the brightness of that pixel vary as I move along this sort of line here? So in other words, this is brightness of pixel, and that is the 70 or so pixels that I've chosen along a little stretch of the carrier deck that should, in principle, all be the same color, all be the same brightness. And you can see that on a scale of here 60 to 80, that, most of the pixels are a brightness of about 70. It doesn't matter what the units are, a brightness of about 70. And there is variation. There's always noise. There's always variation. Not least because this image ended up as a JPEG image, and there's always artifacts in the imagery that produce variations in pixel intensities. So that, to me, looked perfectly and utterly natural. But when I did the same looking at what's going on next to the UFO, I found on the same scale of pixel intensity and pixel position, I found normal variations, and then, whoa, identical, 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 and then a bit of variation. So in other words, I can definitively say that there are some pixels right next door to this UFO that I know have been doctored. There is no way that that would occur naturally. It's essentially impossible that a natural variation would give you, I don't know how many, 20 pixels or so, all of exactly the same brightness. So that will never happen. So that is quite definitely a doctored image. Similarly, I took this one, shocking new footage of alien ship over Chicago. The best UFO sighting in May 2015. Well, if this is the best that May 2015 had to offer, it wasn't a good month, I reckon. You can't really see what's going on, but that doesn't stop you if you do a little bit of image processing. I processed it to bring out the object, this shocking new footage of what turned out to be a triangular UFO, and there it is. What's going on in the background? Well, there's a little bit of mottling. Again, this sort of noise. This is perfectly natural. That's what happens. You don't expect to find the intensity of a chunk of sky to be exactly the same from one pixel to the next. You expect it to be a little bit noisy and a little bit mottled. That's fine. But look at the object itself. Its edges are razor sharp compared to the sort of variation that you see in the sky. If that was truly an object in the sky and you've taken a picture, then you would expect the edges of this to be just as messy as the sort of background that you get here. So again, you can definitively say that object does not belong with this sky. This has been doctored. The final picture of UFO, it's just an assumption, but in this case it was a still from a video of somebody photographing out of their window, obviously of a commercial aircraft, and they saw this thing fly by. I looked at that and I thought, this is odd. I'm not much of a PC gamer myself, but it didn't take me very long to realize that this thing was actually a troop carrier from a certain video game that I'm not allowed to mention due to legal reasons, but it's clear that they've taken a standard CGI craft and then just sort of added it into this video to make it look like this craft was flying past this commercial airliner. A relatively easy thing to do these days with image processing software and video processing software. It's relatively easy to doctor images and to doctor videos. And I can't really finish without agreeing that there is a fifth category. I've dealt with man-made, I've dealt with natural, I've dealt with image artifacts, and I've dealt with fakery. But of course, it's always possible that these odd things that are going on in the sky, some of them are the result of extraterrestrial visitation. We have to admit that that's a possibility. Somebody's made our job a little easier by documenting all the types of UFO that exist. So here's all of the flying saucers that you're ever likely to see. I really don't see how people can tell the difference between A5 and A6. You can probably just barely make out the letters anyway. But all of these are apparently different classifications of UFOs. Someone has been very busy. One thing that I found was quite interesting, you perhaps can't read it at the bottom there, but it says UFO models based on actual sightings. So this is somebody who's taken the verbal reports of lots of people who've seen these, not from images, unfortunately, because images like this don't exist, but they've taken reports of people saying, oh yes, it looked like a hubcap, it looked like a hubcap with lights on it or whatever, and have thus documented 80 different varieties. But I thought it was quite interesting that this is UFO sightings set 1. So there's presumably another set 2 with another 80 of these? I don't quite know. Somebody has indeed been very busy. But what does get me very annoyed is the sort of programs that you find on trash TV, which say, here's proof of alien visitation, or here we can see a picture of Rendlesham Forest over in East Anglia, where clearly we can see signs that a triangular UFO has landed. And I look at that and I think, where's this evidence that a triangular UFO has landed? And just to make it easy, they then say, well, there's the evidence. Look, let me give you a triangle. Now you can see quite obviously that there are 3 dark objects in the ground. These are clearly where the feet of the triangular UFO were sitting. The fact that they don't seem to be particularly well positioned in the triangle doesn't seem to be something that worries them. But this idea that you can convince people of whatever you want by saying, look, well, actually there's nothing there, but if you actually then home in and guide people, then they'll start to say, oh yeah, actually I can see there's something there. Yeah, clearly that is a triangular UFO footprint there. That is not even deserved of evidence. I wouldn't even call it evidence that needs to be trashed. I don't think that's evidence in any sense of the word. But we can then ask ourselves, well, okay, I have not found, and I don't think anybody has found, any images of any objects which could be construed as being evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. But, okay, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. What about the lack of evidence for extraterrestrial UFOs? Perhaps you've seen this argument before. We can start with the number of stars in the Milky Way, which is something like 300 billion. Most of them have planetary systems. Until recently, we didn't know how many stars in the Milky Way had planets going around them. Now we've got a pretty good idea. It's about half of them. So if it's half of them, there are something like 150 billion solar systems in the Milky Way. How many have Earth-like planets? Again, until a few years ago, we really didn't know how likely it was that Earth-like planets existed in other solar systems. Now we've got a pretty good idea. Of all the solar systems that exist, quite a high percentage of them seem to have Earth-like planets. So let's divide that by 3. So perhaps there are 50 billion Earth-like planets in the Milky Way. It's impossible to work out the likelihood of life evolving on an Earth-like planet. Some people will say it's very unlikely. To quote Jurassic Park, life will always find a way. Some people believe that under the right conditions, life is inevitable. It's an inevitable result as long as you give it long enough. That is a caveat. You've got to give it probably a few billion years. You can't expect it to pop up in just a few 100,000 years. So we don't know how likely it is that life originated on any given Earth-like planet. But we can say, let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't happen. So we divide by 100, we get 500 million. How often does that life develop into complex life? Here on Earth, we've got complex life on the surface of the Earth, and we've got complex life at the bottom of the ocean that started around these black smokers, where the energy they're using is volcanic rather than solar. So maybe complex life will always develop from simpler life as long as you give it long enough. Let's say that it doesn't happen 99% of the time, so let's divide by another 100. That gives us 5 million planets on which complex life has developed. What about intelligent life? Again, no one really has got any idea, so let me just pull a number out of thin air and say that 99% of the time, intelligent life never evolves. So let's divide by another 100. That gets us down to 50,000. If there are 50,000 Earth-like planets with intelligent life, where are they? How come we haven't been visited? Is it because the stars are just too far away? Is it because we are too boring and nobody wants to visit us? Is it because, yes, there might be lots of civilizations made, but maybe they don't last long. Maybe they all blow themselves out of existence a few years after they start, and they never become spacefaring nations. They never get to the point where they can build extraterrestrial spacecraft that can ultimately visit us. So that is, of course, just a guess. I've taken intelligent life to be a 1 in a million event. Maybe it's more likely than that, maybe it's less likely. This is not supposed to be an answer, this is just supposed to be food for thought. Let me finish with this picture. Does anybody recognize it? Okay, the important thing is that little dot there, which I almost got rid of accidentally by cleaning up the image. That is the important dot. That's Earth. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being, whoever was, lived out their lives. On a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Pale blue dot from Carl Sagan, 1994. This is a reminder that that is all we know. That dot is Earth, and that is all we know. Life, we only know about terrestrial life. We can guess as much as we like about extraterrestrial life, but the only thing we know is that life occurred on Earth. It started, and we're here to witness that. No amount of UFOs in the daytime or nighttime skies is going to be evidence that we've been visited by extraterrestrial civilizations. But what I find more unsettling is not the fact that we might have been visited, but the fact that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.
Steve Barrett, on a fantastic talk. I'm sure you will all agree